Magnum.
Yeah.
At Trafalgar Square, and you met a Magnum photographer?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what actually happened was that I was in Trafalgar Square shooting pictures of pigeons.
Yes.
It's not the first person that's ever shot pictures of pigeons. And there was another person shooting pigeons who came up to me, and I thought I was being picked up or something. He said, I think you're a very good photographer. He said, I can tell photographers by watching them work, you know. So I thought, well, that's a strange line, but and being very heterosexual, extremely at that time heterosexual. But anyway, it was Sergio Loren.
Yes.
Who turned out later, when I had to be, in my opinion, with Weegee and Kudelka, the three greatest photographers. And what Sergio said was that, he said some people shoot pictures and other people you can see are concentrating on shooting pictures. Mm. And he said you can sometimes tell that deep concentration of somebody who's obviously doing it for a purpose, whatever that purpose is. And so we became friends, and he looked at my pictures. Now at that time, of course, I was shooting anything to make a living, you know, but I was shooting some things not as well as people around me. So that when it was the sort of current affairs-y sort of story, I mean, if it had violence in it, McCullen did it better than anybody. And if it was politically, you had to be politically astute, then Philip Jones Griffiths did it better, because Philip was the person who had the political brain more than anybody else. He really understood his politics. I mean, and so what I did was I don't know who it was, but somebody said I always did Tinsel Society most of the time. But of course you can't, i.e. sheepdog trials or something like that. I used to find those lovely. You know, it goes back to army officer buying his wife a hat. But it was very difficult to make a living out of that sort of stuff. Sergio looked at my pictures and said, this is what you should be doing. You know, this other current affairs thing, by all means do it, but know in your head that you're in the second division in that. Yeah. Whereas in this other thing, perhaps you have something that other people don't do. I had a terrific bit of luck, and that was that the colour supplement started at that time, 1961, I think it was, or anything. And what happened was that this other group of photographers were vying for the current affairs-y thing, of which most of the stuff in the magazine was that. But I had a little niche that nobody else was doing. Right. And so literally every story I did was published because nobody else was doing that. And Sergio introduced me to a man called John Hillison, who at that time was the Magnum agent. He represented many other people besides Magnum, but it was the Magnum agent in London. And it was through going into that office that I saw the contact sheets that were so influential in my life. Yeah. But also it meant that I came into contact with the Magnum photographers, and by now I knew what Magnum was. Yes. At the time I met Sergio, I didn't have a clue. I'd never heard of it, you know. Right. And so because the magazines were really quite good at that time, so there was a magazine called Queen and Town, and Queen magazine had a very good picture editor called Mark Boxer, and they brought over Bruce Davidson, for example, and Brian Brake from New Zealand, and Ernst Haas, I think. They all worked for Queen magazine at various things. Elliot Irwitt came over. That's why it's so nonsensical. Sometimes you hear people trying to pretend that photography started, and interest in photography started in the 70s, you know. What it means is that somebody had a gallery at that time and they tried to pretend that they had a big influence. all these photographers were all over in the early 60s. And I, I just liked what was going on, basically. So...
it means it opened doors for you, presumably.
Well, what happened was
David.
that I met Bruce Davison.
Yes.
So Bruce Davison came over for Queen magazine, and I instantly latched myself to him and said, "Look, do you want a guide?" Which was exactly what he needed, because the information he was getting from the research people at Queen was in a certain kind of rather socialistic, establishment type of affair, whereas I could introduce him to a different. But so I spent a lot of time with Bruce, and then Elliot came over, and I did the same thing very deliberately. Sort of said, "I'm happy to be your assistant." You know,
right? Okay.
And so, not only did I learn enormously from working with them and seeing the way that they work, but I also had a stronger connection to the London Magnum office. Right. So, by and large, it never seemed to me a problem of getting into Magnum, because I found myself able to enthuse about photography as much as Bruce Davison did and Elliot did. And I realised that I had the same kind of thought process that they had, the attention to detail, the attention to the subject matter of what it was really about and what I was trying to do. And so every time the Magnum people came over, I met them. And so, and George Roger had become, who was the great British Magnum photographer, founder, became a friend. And then George introduced me to Cartier-Bresson, and I got on well with him as well. So my process into Magnum was kind of eased in quite easily. Yeah. And to be honest, I mean, it sounds pompous, but I never thought I wouldn't get in, if you see what I mean. It just seemed to me it was
a natural progression.
A natural progression. It is, for most people, it's a pretty torturous thing, because they don't have those sort of feelings. That sort of entree.
And what sort of hands-on do you have with Magnum now? Do you?
All the time. I said, I go up to the office. I mean, now I'm South Wales, but I go up to the office once a month, I suppose. Right. And obviously with email and all that sort of stuff, there's not a day goes by when there isn't emails from somebody about something. You know. Yeah. So the contact is very close. But Magnum is. It's an agency like any other agency, except that the difference is that it's owned by the photographers rather than being an agency that employs photographers.
Indeed, yes.
So that has advantages and disadvantages. Right. The advantages is that everything within Magnum is based on things like, terrible words like integrity and honesty and all that. And if you deviate from that at all, you're slapped down by the other photographers, because part of the reputation of Magnum is that it does things really, really thoroughly. Yes. And with whatever, again, you can have the debate about the word integrity, but with great humanity and great integrity. Yes. And I fitted into that sort of family. It's very important that you get on with the other people, that you get on with the staff. And, more people come into Magnum and then don't become a member because of their relation with a bad relation with the staff than through, if you get into the nominee status in Magnum, it's pretty obvious that you take pretty good pictures. Indeed. But actually that's only a part of it. Yes. Okay. The part of it is that, they always used to say if a Magnum photographer goes somewhere and does a story, it's much, much easier for the next person that comes along. They leave that kind of feeling behind them, which is a nice thing for somebody to have said, and I hope it continues. Yes. But it is lovely, but the main thing you get out of it is the companionship of the family, of people around you that are the best. I mean, we have tremendous staff. They really are the best. And of course, the photographers, to get into Magnum, you have to be voted in by the other photographers.
Indeed.
And it's a long process of discussion, etc., etc. By and large, I don't think Magnum makes many mistakes. You know, I mean, I if I look through the members at the moment, I don't think there's anybody there that I would say shouldn't be there, even on a personal level. Even those I don't like very much. There's certain photographers I just don't particularly like, or I might not like their pictures personally. I know what they do, but as photographers within their genre, I think it's reasonable to say they are the best.
Yes,
they are the best, and that's great, because it means that, you know, if I go up to the office and there happens to be somebody in from New York or Paris, or you go and have lunch, and the conversation is kind of different from the conversation you tend to have with other photographers.
Yeah.
Other photographers tend to, in the main, talk about money and whether they've got a job or whether they haven't. Magnum photographers never. All they're interested in is subject matter. You know, what are you working on? Is that interesting? What is your approach to that particular story? And that's so refreshing sometimes. One of the problems with Magnum is that because it was run by photographers, you have the photographers that think they know something about finance running the financial side of it. Now, that was okay for many, many, many years because it was pretty simple. But as it got more and more complicated, more and more photographers, and so you have a lot of these tremendous rows one hears about within Magnum were actually to do with finance. It would be to do with 3 or 4 people all saying, you know, this is the way to do it. That's enough. When we finally came to our senses and realised we needed to get somebody really good in to head up and deal with the finance, we managed by sheer luck to bring this wonderful guy, David. He is, you know, a heavyweight. He is the guy that negotiates between the Premiership lead and Sky Television, you know. So he deals with the $16 billion deal. So we're talking about somebody who really knows what they're talking about. And he is, at the moment, the person that deals with everything to do with the future finances of Magnum, etc., etc. Now, the beauty about that is that when you go to a meeting and you've got 2 people that really don't know absolutely what they're talking about having an argument, he would just step in and say, shut up, you know. And they had enough sense to realise that he knew what he was talking about and they didn't, so they shut up. So the Magnum meetings now are incredibly quiet because there's none of that thing. And not only that, but the whole finances are therefore being sorted out, and you know, I mean, simple things like if we were in financial problems, you know, people used to say, oh, well, we need to cut back on the staff, you know. When David came in, he said, no, you don't cut back on the staff, you get better staff. You go up market, you don't go down market. You know, you make sure that what you've got is great staff, and if you've got great staff, then you produce more and you make more money. And of course, he was absolutely right. I mean, we've got unbelievable staff now. We've pinched them from the head of Christie's, the head of the Sotheby's, in the Cultural Studies Department. A very high-ranking person from Reuters has come in, and
wow.
and so it's really made a difference. You suddenly find the atmosphere in the office. It was always very friendly, but now it's learned in a way. The people know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And that rubs off, and it makes you want to, you know, the fact that I rushed around in Paris was partly to do with having shot the pictures of this terror thing. I'm 81, so it's not easy to run around Paris when there's a lot of young photographers doing that. But I did have the experience to download quicker than anybody else, you know. But I could download quicker because I had enough sense to realise that I can't compete with them running, but I can get my pictures out quicker, which means something. Yeah. But I had faith in the Magnum office doing it.
Right.
And so Magnum is very, very healthy at the moment. It's in really good shape. And also the young photographers that are coming in. I mean, the latest sort of the last dozen photographers, 10 photographers we brought in are just wonderful. And so Magnum is in really, really good hands with them. They're nice, they're pleasant, they're very humanistic, and they're brilliant photographers and very brave. Much less to do with trying to do stuff of which the general public would enjoy, much more to do with it's an intellectual exercise of which the head of the gallery can promote themselves in a further direction. And in my opinion, sadly, it's at its worst it's ever been now, in that what you have is somebody who is, it does it very well, except that all the time, it always seems to me as though it's a weeny bit self-promotion. I can find this obscure Czechoslovakian photographer, and my feeling is, who cares a shit? If you're going to have a gallery in Wales, let's have a policy. You either show the best in the world to people that have never seen it. Yeah. For example, there's never been a Cartier-Bresson exhibition in Wales. That's crazy.
Yes.
So you could show those sort of people to the public, or you can show young people and promote young people, or you can show the best of other people that have photographed in Wales. Now that seems to be a simple policy, which would be advantageous to have. But instead of that, you have this weird sort of conceptual thing, perfectly valid form of photography, but it's a very, very tiny, narrow genre. And it dominates the gallery. Yes. So, in my opinion, nobody goes anymore. No. Whereas, I mean, one of the things I'm saying to the museum is that the first thing that I think this new curator's got to be, and it's very difficult because I have to not look as though I'm, being over pushy about it, but is to link up with the education department, of which is a very good department in the university. And the first thing they've got to do is to devise a way of openings not being for people that go and buy a new hat to come to the opening, but to attract taxi drivers. Yes. And it's a different... It's very difficult for a museum because they're so used to this cosy establishment-y sort of, social thing, We'll all have wine at the opening. Bugger that. I would prefer them to have beer at the opening. Yes. And everybody, have four times as many people.
Democratize it.
Yeah. Now, I think it's very easy to do. I think it's easy to do. You stop having 3 lectures a year about sort of the Bauhaus and the feeling of that. You have an exhibition called Sex, and a lecture called Sex. And if you have a lecture which is called Sex, you've got 200 people come to it. Yes. You can then do it very brilliantly within that thing and show the history of, from the daguerreotype and pornographic pictures to whatever you want to do, and violence you can have. But it's got to be titles of which the general public understand.
Aren't we in a situation, though, where the establishment will never, ever put their head on a block?
Well, they might if they think money's involved.
Like
the key.
And
box office.
And so if box office, and B, in my case, if I give them my archives and I give them enough pictures, I'm giving them 1,500 prints. Well, in terms of, a print of mine at the moment sells, they don't sell that many, so it's an artificial thing. But it sells for £1,000. That's 1,500 times 1,000 is the value. And the accountant there is going to say, if you've got that collection in, that means the assets of this museum are, a few million. Yeah. That has a clout. Yes. Now, it's an artificial clout because, if I sell 20 pictures a year, 30 pictures a year, that's doing very well. 1,500 pictures, they're not gonna sell. But in terms of the accountancy and the books, it's very powerful. And so that, I think, is the way you have to do it nowadays. You have to battle them on their own ground, and that is the sort of ground. And then you also have to battle through this establishment-y thing of the people that buy a new hat to go to the opening.
Yes.
Because it's really refreshing to say that at Photo Gallery, because people, and many of the photographers we've spoken to, just don't bring it up in conversation because they don't feel that institution that organisation is relevant to them. How sad is that?
It's so sad. It is so sad because the reason it's sad is because they get all the money. There was a little gallery run by a Polish guy and somebody else called the Third Floor Gallery, yes. And within a year that had a stature around everybody. People knew about it, but of course they had no money. The Arts Council said silly things like, "Oh, well, you've got to be established for 2 years before," and I mean, it's so ludicrous. They needed the money, and the two kids that were running it, who were really enthusiastic and cared about and knew who all the really good young photographers were, etc. They were brilliant, but they've gone off to shoot pictures instead, and sadly, in my opinion, the person that's running it now is very good, very well meaning, etc., etc., but doesn't have that kind of whatever it is personality that they had. And so that I thought was wonderful and should potentially have been. But the photo gallery is okay if you're interested in that tiny little genre of what the guy...
Picking up another point in your career, because you spent 17 years with the Newport course. Because that happened by accident, in a way.
It kind of happened by accident. What happened was that I had realised that living in London in basically 1970, I think it was, that I was doing more things that I would prefer not to have to do.
Yes.
Just to pay for the cost of living in London. It wasn't that I was doing things which I didn't enjoy doing. I worked on some films and obviously, I became very friendly with people like Jane Fonda, and you don't knock that.
You spent a year with
a year with her,
yes.
And that was very close and very intimate and was lovely, etc. But what was wonderful about it was her. It wasn't, I didn't find a lot of the time the pictures are all that interesting, I mean, I shot some fashion at that time, and I had a contract with Harper's Bazaar, but I used to just at the end of the session give the film to the picture editor. I didn't even bother to look at the stuff. I wasn't that interested in the pictures. I was interested in the phenomenon of doing it, which was fun.
Yes.
You go to the Canary Islands with 6 models. It's fun.
Yes,
but the pictures, for me, particularly as I knew that all I was top of the second division in fashion. I was never going to be Richard Avedon or Guy Bourdin or Penn. They care about clothes. Yeah. And fashion photography is about, selling frocks, basically.
Yeah.
That's what you've got to do. Now, they cared about it. I didn't. I did it well enough to be at a pretty high level. But I was in London. I was finding myself having to do things like this to give me enough money to go and do what I really wanted to do. And I realised that if I came back to Wales, I could still do what I wanted to do, but it would be about a third of the cost. And so that's why I came back. When I came back to Wales, to the credit of the Welsh Arts Council at that time, there was somebody called Peter Jones there, and a really nice lady called Isabel Hitchings, I think her name was, and somehow they knew I'd come back and knew of me. And so they asked me they gave me £600, I remember, to do something about Wales. And so I decided that I would try to discover what was meant by the word culture.
Yes.
Whenever I was back home in Wales, I was always talking about, this is my culture, this is my culture. And whenever I sort of tried to discuss with somebody what that meant, nobody actually came up with an explanation. They just used the word a lot, as though it was all terribly important, but nobody could, And I met somebody called Raymond Williams, who was really fine, in my opinion, one of the great Welsh writers.
Indeed.
And he wrote a book called Culture. I contacted him because I'd seen this book called Culture. And basically what he was saying is that this is a very complicated word, But in very simple terms, he was saying that, we only have one word, whereas in many other countries they have many words. But by and large, in our discussions, it came to the conclusion that culture is based enormous amount on weather conditions and things. So if you live in a very wet country on the top of a mountain, you develop a different culture than if you live in the desert where it's hot and, So in a way it's to do with lifestyle, and in a way it's to do with isolation where you are, and isolation builds a separate language, which is part of it, and it builds religion of some sort, which is part of the whole thing. But in Wales, it's very difficult to define what any of that is, because, you have the language, which is, in my opinion, overpowerful in Wales. I mean, I would defend it, as was it Emile Zola said, to my last breath or something. But sometimes I feel it has too much influence. If I had to learn a language, I don't speak Welsh, but if I had to learn a language, I would want to speak Spanish or Chinese. I wouldn't want to speak Welsh, So I started to try to discover. So I thought, I'm a photographer, so maybe the only way I can discover what is meant by my culture is to actually try to shoot 3 books. One is on the way we live in Wales, one is to do with the people that live in Wales, and one is to do with the landscape of Wales. That would cover everything. And so I did what I normally do, is I sketched out on paper, what people do in Wales. So I still have the bits of paper, so I would make lists like, say, sport, obviously, and education and universities and farming and coal and steel. And so I'd make this list of all the things that I felt ought to be covered. And then I would subdivide those. So under sport, I would say, well, the important one is obviously rugby, but there is also, football and this. And then I'd have like a spider's web, of which I knew that I had to cover all of these things. And then it's a matter of, going to wherever and doing whatever you want to within it. Now, out of that came the book Land of My Father.
Yes.
Again, when I look at it, I still had no idea what was meant by Welsh culture, because I discovered that there is more difference between living in Pembrokeshire and living in TINTERN than living in North Wales. Or, these places are totally different.
Absolutely.
So there isn't seem to be overall thing within it. But having said that, whenever I show the book to people, they do say it's very Welsh, which I find really interesting, because nobody can pinpoint why it's very Welsh, but it is very Welsh. Yeah. And I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Because photography is obviously somehow sending out some sort of vibes which are not literary vibes. Yeah. They can't be described.
No.
They do something, and the fact that it does that, to me, is lovely. And so then one of the great problems with photography is access. And if you are, like I am, working all the time freelance and not, if you work, one of the great advantages of working for a magazine is you usually have access. So when I went to do the portraits of the people that live in Wales, I had to find a way of getting access. So I invented this little phrase, "You have enriched my life." So I would write to people and say, "Dear Dame Margaret Price, you have enriched my life by your..." And then I would, quote a couple of DVDs I'd got and her performance and so and so and so and so. And of course, anybody that's been told you've enriched their life, they say yes. So that was my way of getting in with these people, and I enjoyed doing that book immensely. It was incredible hard work and
over a long period of time as well.
I only had a year and a bit to shoot it, because Seren said they would publish it, but they had a publishing date, and so I had to shoot 101 pictures in less than a year. Now, if you think it takes roughly a day to write the letters and do the research to set up, and a day to shoot the picture, and a day to print it afterwards, I actually shot 300 and something days out of the year to get there. So it was really hard work. Really, really hard work.
Yeah.
And I tried to do something which I don't think anybody has ever noticed. I tried to sort of make a political thing by asking very simple questions to everybody. So the basic questions were, where are you born? How long have you lived in Wales? What's your first language? What's your second language? And everybody under the picture had this thing. And so you came up with all sorts of wonderful things. For example, David Wigley, who is, in my opinion, one of the great Welshmen, he was one of the only politicians that I actually believed in, etc., was actually born in Derbyshire.
He was, yes.
And these sort of things I thought were very interesting, were thrown up. And in the book, they're there, but I don't think anybody's ever looked at it or seen it or realised that it, in theory, has some significance, But, and then I'm doing one at the moment on landscape, which is, all I knew about the landscape was that I hadn't shot much of it. And I didn't want to do what other people had done, so I didn't want to pretend I was Ansel Adams.
No,
he'd done it pretty well, so why redo what he's done? And I didn't want to do sort of travelogue-y pictures. This is my prettiest view, and I certainly didn't want to drive from Cardiff to North Wales to Rhyl or something, shooting a picture every 400 yards out the window and then writing 5 pages of text as to why this was terribly significant, because the reality is I don't think it's very significant, So for a long, long time I didn't know how to do it. And then I found a very early book of the geology of Wales.
Yeah.
And looking at that, I loved the text in it. I loved the scientists were so precise about what they were in. But I didn't think the illustrations were that interesting.
No.
So I suddenly thought, well, why don't I do the landscape the wrong way round? Why don't I find experts that tell me what I ought to be photographing, not subjectively? So I went to the head of geology at Cardiff University, and I said to him, if you have a son, where would you take him to show him the oldest rock in Wales? There's a bit of it there.
Right.
And he said, oh, that's an interesting concept. So he said, the Precambrian this, and I said, no, cut out the academic. I want to know the map reference of where it is. And so he said, oh, what an interesting idea. So a few days later, he sent me a 10 Ordnance Survey, 10 figure map reference, and said, if you go in that field on the top of Hatton Hill, those are the oldest rocks in Wales.
Wow.
So then I could go and do whatever I like, but my job was to photograph those rocks however I wanted.
Yes.
I could be close, I could be a long way away, I could do whatever I wanted with it. I could do it. And so we then, went back to him and said, well, what's the best example of a glacier valley? What's the best example of a rock fold? Nice. So we went through geology, and then I moved on to anthropology and said, what is the first example in the country of Neolithic man, and
right, okay.
And then I could photograph those sort of things, and then I started to investigate when was the first use of the word landscape, And you know, it's interesting because castles were built to suppress people, and yet at some point they suddenly became romantic in paintings, and so you can see what I'm saying, and very simple things like north, south, east, west. Well, that is dictating something. So you can go and photograph, you know, Mouse Island, which is the north, Rus, which is the south.
Yes.
The east is more difficult because it's on private land, in fact, and the people are a bit naughty about letting you get on there, so you have to sneak in. And then the west is the only one I haven't done now, because that's the lighthouse way off. It's like 20 miles off St David out, so you have to get a boat to go out there and all that sort of thing. But that's the way I'm tackling the landscape.
When do you hope to? When do you hope to publish that?
Well, it's really got to be finished by next July, because I did a mistake. I put it as being the last book, thinking it would be the simplest to do, i.e. landscape is there all the time. You know, you don't have, if you want to go back, if you've done it wrong, you can go back, you know, and it's not going to move that much. But what I hadn't realised is that I get older, and that things begin to ache and your legs go. And I discovered this when I tried to get up Hatton Hill the first time, because I went to go there and I couldn't get up there. I just couldn't get up there. So I then had to come back and say, well, the only way I can do this is to go to the gym. So I spent a year getting fit enough
to walk up there,
to walk up Hatton Hill. You know, so it was very good because it meant I did that. But it has been going on too long, you know, and I'm pretty fit. I go to the gym 3 times a week and etc. But however much you go to the gym, as you get older, you get weaker. And so and of course the thing is that you tend to put off the things that are most difficult. Like there's a wonderful bridge which bizarrely is right in the middle of moorland, and nobody quite knows. It was obviously on a drover's road or some sort of a pack horse road. But it's there. But it's 4.5 miles into the middle of really tough terrain. So that's 4.5 miles there and 4.5, and I've still got to do that, you know. Well, if I don't do that by next July, I think the reality is that I probably won't be able to do it, you know. And yet for me it is quite an important, because it's that symbolic of a certain kind of Welsh bridge, you know, and there's a wonderful hill fort in North Wales near Trefor, I think.
Oh yes, yes, absolutely.
And I haven't photographed that, and it seems to be it's very important. That's exactly it. And I need to do that because it's, you know, from the period it's very important. But again, my guess is it's probably quite a rough climb to get up there.
Not bad.
Not bad.
No, it's not bad.
Okay, well,
if you ever need a companion,
really?
I'll come with you. Yes.
Oh, yeah. No. So you know, things like that, and I begin to realise my legs are running out, etc. But I try very hard to overcome the problems each time. But sometimes problems can't be overcome. You know.
Yeah. Do you do stuff locally in TINTERN?
I love, you know, I shoot pictures all the time. And all I'm interested in is seeing something, thinking it's visually interesting or that the content is interesting, so I photograph it. So I suddenly thought, what would be a project that I could do, which I could probably do forever? And I saw a quote by John Updike. I was reading John Updike, American writer, who writes very much about suburbia. And he had this wonderful quote talking about the exotic of the mundane.
Yes, indeed.
And I thought, this is a wonderful idea. The idea that, going back to the army officer buying his wife a hat, in a way is the exotic of the mundane. It was absolutely me. It's what I wanted to do at the beginning, you know, was to spend my life photographing officers buying their wives' hat or the equivalent, and I've stuck to that. perhaps that's what we call authorship, is knowing exactly what it is you wanted to do and not really deviating very much from it. And so I suddenly thought, well, my village is it's a nice village. Wordsworth said it's the most beautiful place in the world, although I later discovered he'd only ever been to 2 places, but why not? If he said it, fine, I'm happy to go along. But it is a nice village and they're nice people and it has a sense of community.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, maybe I'll do that. If I got a zither frame, I can get round the village. So I started to photograph the village. Yeah. I've been a little bit disappointed about it because I thought it might, I had visions of going into people's homes and photographing them all play Monopoly and things. And of course, you suddenly discover that they don't anymore. It's almost impossible to go into somebody's home and get a family community activity. They don't even eat together anymore. No. And so I ended up photographing all the events, bizarrely being somebody who has no religious beliefs whatsoever. One of my friends is a woman who's the local priest, Nora, and I suddenly discovered that she was doing more in the village than anybody, so that I had this strange sort of thing of realising the person that was in many ways the most productive person in the village happened to be religious, and so we sort of came to a pact that I wouldn't try to change her beliefs and she wouldn't try to change mine, and so I've shot a terrific amount in the church, to do with birth, death, baptism, events, and all that sort of stuff. So the event side of everything is really well covered, but the sort of more personal side. Luckily I've got a few friends that have family, and so, for example, my dear friend who they run the garage, the local garage, I will go and have Christmas with them. And now, luckily, they have quite a big family, so that lets me photograph a family at Christmas. But things which I was disappointed by, I put out a thing when I was starting it that, if there were any young people that were the least bit interested in even just journalism, etc., I would say, look, I've got a lot of experience, 60 years of experience. Perhaps I could pass on some of that experience, and I could do it by I'd photograph, and then I could assign people to go and interview all the people. Not one single young person came forward to...
Good gracious me.
To do this.
No, given that opportunity,
Not one single person. And I thought, is that different from... I don't know if it was different than when I was that age, or the opportunity was there, but my guess is that they were too busy playing on their Game Boys or whatever they is.
Yes. Do you? When you started your course in Newport,
yes.
How did you? Because there's a kind of link. How did you? Because people would apply for the course.
Yes.
How did you choose those people, David?
Oh, yeah. Well, there was a question you asked earlier, which I became very friendly with Peter Jones, who was the person at the Arts Council. Yeah. Incredibly constructive man, and they organised some wonderful exhibitions at the museum at that time. He, in conversation, said to me, do you think it's possible to teach photography, And I, in my ignorance or naivety, said, yes, of course it is, but only if you teach it as painting in the Middle Ages was taught, as an apprenticeship thing. So I said, all you need to do is to have people that have really done it, who pass on their accurate information to people that really want to do it. So you swap experience for potential.
Yes.
I said, if you set something up like that, then I think you can teach it. And in my own case, I was very lucky very early on, because I'd met Sergio Loren, who was at that time a member of Magnum. I didn't know what Magnum was at that time. But he introduced me to the Magnum agent in London, And I learned more from looking at the contact sheets. If you look at the contact sheets of Mark Reboux or whoever, Bresson, and said, boy, oh boy, do you see. But what I discovered looking at all these contact sheets, I used to go into the office every night and absorb contact sheets. What I found surprising was that all the various photographers, who by this time I'd realised were wonderful photographers, looking at their contact sheets, they all had the same thing in common, is that they all realised that there were two controls in photography. One is where you stand, and one is when you press the button.
Yeah.
And it is as simple as that. If you stand in the right place and press the button at the right time, you get a picture. And they all did it the same way, by not being arrogant and thinking you can go and shoot one picture, but they all seemed to, you could see in the contact sheets, they sensed a situation which might produce something, whatever that something is, and then they would shoot pictures as they got into a better position, and you could then see them in that position waiting for something to happen or the thing to end. Very often nothing happened. But you can read that in the contact sheet.
Yes.
And so when I set up the course, what happened was that Peter Jones introduced me to John Wright, who was a very laid-back guy who was head of the art school. It was an art school at that time.
Yes.
And John Wright literally said, oh, OK, why don't you set this up in whatever way you like, you know. And so I had a free hand. So I made certain conditions. One is that we didn't have qualifications. I didn't want people all coming to get a qualification. And later, I actually said I didn't want it to be a BA course. You know, we'd just give a college diploma sort of thing. Because the problem with being a BA course is that it's, in a way, the structure of the course is dictated by governments and things like that. And as they were trying desperately to save money, it meant that you'd go from being an apprentice method, you know, the practitioner passing on experience, to suddenly having 100 people in a lecture theatre being talked to, because that made the staff-student ratio better. So that developed the whole sort of theoretical side of photography, which is perfectly valid. You know, if people want to talk about photography and discuss it and be philosophers at a, in my opinion, pretty low-level philosophy, but if they want to do all those things, absolutely fine. But don't pretend that that's going to produce photographers other than in a very narrow genre of photography.
Yes.
Perfectly valid genre, you know, if that's what you want to do, but it is a tiny little genre. You know, it's nowhere near the amount of people that, for example, are scientific or medical photographers or wedding photographers. It's a minor part. As I say, perfectly valid, and if you want to do it, fine. But I didn't want to get in that field. And so, having set up the course in this very practical way, of which we made it very clear that our job was to get people jobs afterwards, you know, that people should survive in whatever field of documentary they wanted to do. Having set up there, the second that the pressure was on to become a BA course, I left. That's when I left. That was the final thing. You know. They said, you know, you have to be a BA course. I said, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Did you, I mean, presumably you interviewed people when to go on the course?
Well, we interviewed people, but we interviewed people in a strange sort of way, because I was never interested in their pictures. So normally, you know, people would come, you know, on courses with pictures, and I was interested in what they were interested in.
Yes.
My thought process in this was that I can teach somebody to shoot pictures. That's easy. You know, to a certain standard.
Yeah.
What I can't do is teach people to be interested in something.
Indeed.
And I find it discouraging now, because very often I see young people and they come and I say, well, before we start discussing photography, what are you interested in? So if you say, well, I'm interested in social matters, and you say, I spend 2 days a week working in an old folks' home, helping out, doing this, that and the other, I say, I can teach you how to shoot pictures of those people in that old folks' home. Yes. What I can't do is teach you to be a photographer who has this mythical thing. I'm interested in social issues.
Yes, I know.
You know,
Yeah.
the interest in the social issue has to come first, or the interest in architecture has to come first.
It's about being a human being.
Yeah, and but having knowledge
Yeah.
about what it is you want to photograph.
Yeah.
So if somebody came to me, as one person did, they had a degree already in architecture, and they said, I would like to expand that interest in architecture by taking pictures. I'd say, fine, that's easy to do.
Yeah.
You know, because you know what is the front and back of a building, and you know what, you're not going around saying, oh, I think this is a pretty building. That's not the way you would be thinking if you have a degree in architecture. And it would be the same in anything, whether it be botany or, you know, people that know about flowers, they know why that flower is that shape, what insects pollinates that thing, what is the life cycle of that. If you know all that information, it's pretty easy to take pictures.
Yeah.
You say, I need a picture of this animal and this and this and this.
Yeah.
So the interview process was always to do with what are you interested in.
Yeah.
The easiest people to pick up were people that want to be sports photographers, because you'd say to them, okay, if next weekend you had the chance to go and do something, what would you do? And they'd say, oh, I'd go to Darlington because it's their 100th anniversary of when they changed from a pink shirt to a blue shirt. And you suddenly realise they have all this information.
Yeah.
So I could say, oh, well, that's okay. Now I'll teach you how to make a little picture story out of that.
Yeah.
But just somebody coming and say, I'm interested in sports,
Yeah.
who cares? You know, I'm interested in sports.
Yeah.
So that was the process, which always surprised people, you know.
Right.
So I can teach people to shoot some pictures. What I can't teach people is to have a focused point of view on something.
How many people do you have on that first year?
I think it was 12. 10 or 12 or something like that.
Yeah.
And we did actually, it's a slight lie when I said we didn't have qualification. I discovered that there was something, or rather somebody else told me, who was a very good HMI, that's right, a guy called Hawkins, I think his name was. He was very, very constructive. He came down and I talked to him about it, and he said, well, what you should do is set yourself up as a TOPS course, which was a training opportunity. But anyway, it was to do with people that were being made redundant.
Right. Oh, yes. Okay.
And they could get grants to retrain.
Yeah.
And so that's what we originally did as part of the course. Right. So we got a lot of steel workers and things like that.
Right.
And I very often say, you know, you're going to go on a course. It's going to cost you 27,000 quid to do it. Now, do you really think that you're going to be a better photographer than if you go and buy a round-the-world ticket, a camera, decent pair of shoes, and you go around the world for a year, just shooting anything you like, and at the end of that time, when you begin to understand what it is you find interesting, you then go and do a workshop or do 2 or 3 workshops, each of about a week or 10 days, with somebody who does what you want. So, you know, you might do it with Anders Peterson or somebody, or you might go and do it with whoever, Peter Marlowe, if you like that sort of stuff. Who's going to be the better photographer at the end of that time? You're going to save yourself a staggering amount of money, and you're going to be a better photographer.
And a better all-round.
A better all-round person. Yes. You would have understood what it's like to, you know, and by that time you might have learned, you know, whether you're supposed to take your shoes off if you go into a mosque or not. You know, those things are important to know. You know, how do you learn how not to offend other people in their country? Yeah. Not through some cultural studies thing. You learn by going there and asking and being polite. Yes. And you suddenly discover that all these other countries have very nice, polite people, and that the general public don't want to kill each other or don't want to kill you or you and them, that the only people that want to do these things are people with rather extreme sort of views, and that by and large the world's a rather nice place to be in, you know, and it's fun. And you save yourself a lot of money. When the photo gallery was started, it came out of a series of lectures which came out of the course we were doing at Newport. We decided that what we wanted to do was to get out to a general public. So we discovered that Cardiff University had an extramural department that ran courses in things like basket weaving and this, that and the other, which went out to the general public, and you could do it as an evening workshops and things. So we put forward the idea of having a series of lectures. I forget how many there were, but I think it was 24 lectures or something. And that we could do this through the extramural department at Cardiff University. And what it meant is that something like 150 people, taxi drivers and people like that, all signed up for this course. And what they were suddenly confronted with was people like Bert Hardy and Sir Tom Hopkinson and people like and McCullough and people came down and gave talks about photography, and they were enthralled by it. At the end of it, a few of those people, Steve Bembo was one, Chris Gregory was another, said, look, this is a shame, can't we do something? And Peter Jones, who was at the Arts Council, said, well, what do you want to do? And they said, we'd like to start a gallery. And so Peter, the Arts Council, just instantly gave them some money to start the gallery. Not very much, but a little bit. And so the photo gallery was started. And it was, if you look at the early programme, it was a wonderful programme. All sorts of people. And they brought in people like Derek Jarman, who was the film director, but he'd shot some still pictures and did that. And we showed Burkhuzzle for the first time, and Sue Packer had a wonderful exhibition. And it was very much... And then slowly it got taken over by people whose obvious ambition was to go and be the head of the Tate or something else. And so it started to become much less to do with trying to do stuff of which the general public would enjoy, much more to do with it's an intellectual exercise of which the head of the gallery can promote themselves in a further direction. And in my opinion, sadly, it's at its worst it's ever been now, in that they do it. It does it very well, you know. Except that all the time, it always seems to me as though it's a weeny bit self-promotion. You know, I can find this obscure Czechoslovakian photographer, and my feeling is, who cares a shit? You know, if you're going to have a gallery in Wales, let's have a policy. You either show the best in the world to people that have never seen it. For example, there's never been a Cartier-Bresson exhibition in Wales. That's crazy.
Yes.
So you could show those sort of people to the public, or you can show young people and promote young people, or you can show the best of other people that have photographed in Wales. Now that seems to me a simple policy, which would be advantageous to have. But instead of that, you have this weird sort of conceptual thing, perfectly valid form of photography, but it's a very, very narrow genre. And it dominates the gallery. Yes. So, in my opinion, nobody goes anymore. No. Whereas, I mean, it's so sad. It is so sad because the reason it's sad is because they get all the money. There was a little gallery run by a Polish guy and somebody else called the Third Floor Gallery. Yes. And within a year, that had a stature around everybody. People knew about it. But, of course, they had no money. The Arts Council said silly things like, oh, well, you've got to be established for 2 years before. And I mean, it's so ludicrous. They needed the money. And the two kids that were running it, who were really enthusiastic and cared about and knew who all the really good young photographers were, etc. They were brilliant. But they've gone off to shoot pictures instead. And so that I thought was wonderful and should potentially have been. But the photo gallery is okay if you're interested in that tiny little genre, but that isn't the public.
I mean, diffusion is a too early thing that happens in Cardiff. Do you think does that have relevance? Or
it doesn't to me, because I just think that the people who were in it are so boring. I mean, for example, you see all this pages. There was about 6, 7 huge pictures up on a wall of Native Americans, whatever you like to call them,
yes.
Indian, and then there was all this spiel about living with these people, etc. Well, I spent a year in Arizona on a fellowship with the American government, bicentennial fellowship, and I knew a lot about the Indian tribes there because I was doing a story on premature babies, and the doctors there would go out into these tribes, and that's the way you can get in with the tribes, if you were linked to a hospital because they're interested in that. What you soon discover is that none of them wear these bloody costumes. The only time they wear these costumes is when they have their yearly carnival thing for the tourists.
Yes.
And they will dress up. Now, the pictures there, I was saying to David, whatever his name is, something, I'm sorry, you've got all this spiel about this person doing that. They were taken in an afternoon at one of these dressing up things.
Yes.
They get there, they stand there in front of their tent, and tourists come and take the picture. Yes. And that's what it is. Now, I said, it's to me, it's appalling that somebody didn't know that, because anybody that comes from America knows that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's ignorance.
Yes.
Not only that, I thought the pictures are staggeringly boring.
Yes.
But there was too much of that sort of thing. People that have written lots of text that tell you why these pictures are so important, but you look at the pictures and they're boring.
Yes, yeah.
A lot of work obviously went into it. It's quite difficult, but they would then bring over some American photographers, spend quite a lot of money bringing them over, and you'd think that, hang on, who's ever heard of this person? The only people that have heard of this are the people that read about 4 magazines which are written by so-called cultural studies people in a university who talk to each other, who write for the same magazine. So it's this incestuous little group that write and talk to each other, and therefore they know these people, and nobody else in the photographic world has ever heard of these people. The whole thing is very incestuous, and one can understand how it happens and why it happens, but it's nothing to do with that world of photography.
Is there any subject matter you wouldn't touch as a photographer?
Not really, because my feeling is I'm just interested in the world.
Yes.
And so I look at the world and I take pictures of it.
Yes.
Now, it's not to say that the end product isn't boring as old boots, because there might not be anything that particularly interests me. Yeah. But when it's that sort of thing, I simply take it on myself that it's a puzzle. How do I make something out of this?
Yeah.
Which is interesting, but not stylistically doing it.
Yeah.
One of the problems, I think, with a lot of young photographers is that they try tricks. The second that they're in trouble because they don't understand what's going on, they try a trick. Oh, I can make this all purple in Photoshop and make it look as though it's by infrared. Who cares a shit? My mum can do that. Well, she can't because she's dead. But if she'd been alive, she could do that, or I could teach her how to do it. Mm. And so they're continually trying to do that, or let's make the skies purple, or let's do this or that or the other. And as though that means, it doesn't mean anything.
No.
It means that you know which button to press on a computer to make it thing. The only thing that's interesting is if the picture is a good picture, if it starts off as a good picture. Yes. If you've got a bad picture, you can't make it better.
No.
What you can do is, if you've got a good picture, you can make it worse by messing about with these tricks. So by and large, I think, the picture that you take in the camera should be the picture that comes out at the other end. Obviously, you can, our eyes, because we scan and remember, picks up a greater tonal range than either the trace, whatever that is, at the back, or printing paper, etc., has a far less tonal range. And so it is absolutely reasonable that what you used to do under an enlarger, you can now do in Photoshop. You can enhance the highlights, get detail back there. All you're really trying to do is to get back to visually how you felt you saw something.
Yeah, exactly so, yes.
You don't see something like that. You look out the window and you see it, and then you look in and you adjust to the light that's in here.
Yes.
Well, there's nothing in film or anything that can cope with those two things.
No.
But mine can, because you just simply lay one on top of the other, and so it is reasonable.
Has the technological age then, and the advent of computers and Photoshop and Lightroom and those sort of things, has that given you more armoury for what you do? Has it made a difference to the way you work?
No, I don't think it's made a scrap of difference.
Okay.
It is, I used to have much more of a struggle in the dark room dealing with the contrast and bringing it back than I do now. I mean, I use a program called Lightroom or something. It's unbelievable. I mean, you get the thing there and you think, it'd be quite nice if there was a little bit more detail in these highlights, and there's a little slide, you go, and suddenly the highlights come out. So you can do that sort of thing much easier now than you could in the darkroom. But actually, it's the same process.
Yes.
It's just that you had to have much more technical skill in the darkroom than you have to now with Photoshop. Right. But the picture's still the same picture.
All right.
And as for, is there a difference between digital and film? Well, of course, I suppose there is, but by and large, I don't think so. As I say, the camera, as I said before, is a box with a hole in the front, and you have a different kind of sensitivity at the back of that box. But once that was a daguerreotype or a salt print, or it was an albumen or whatever it is, and all that's happened is that at one point it was silver, and now it's digital. Yes. But by and large, that comes through the front has never changed. And that comes through the front is the important bit.
It is, yes.
The other thing is comparatively less important.
Right.
Obviously, in certain genres and things, it has an importance, but by and large, the genre that I think has been affected most by digital is that we call natural history.
Yeah.
Natural history photography was always based an enormous amount on incredibly clever technical people that knew how to do things that flew through light and flashes went off, and people like Dr. Edgerton, etc., could do these very fast things. Now, kids can go and buy a stop motion thing, for 30 quid. But the beauty about that is that if they want to shoot something underwater, for example, they buy an underwater casing for whatever it costs, 30, 40 quid. If they want the picture of that frog spawning, they have to learn what time of the year the frog spawns. They've got to learn where they're going to find it, how to get underwater. So all of that's developed. So there was, whereas I used to find those exhibitions, the wildlife photographer of the year, always very monotonous and always exactly the same picture, basically. It was the owl coming out of the thing. They had this exhibition at the Science Museum, which was of the natural history of the year. They had an under 16 section, which was magical. It was magical. And there is a terrific development there. And that is because of this, the digital thing makes those things, you can get away from the technical side of it.
Yes.
And you can get on with making the picture.
Yes.
And young people are doing that. They're learning about nature in a way that I suspect they never did, So I thought that was wonderful. I thought it was a lovely exhibition. I enjoyed it.
Do you use a phone to take photographs at all, David?
Not really. Not really. But I don't deliberately not, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
I mean, we have quite a lot of people in Magnum now that are using them quite frequently. For example, Michael Brown actually came into Magnum of which, although we didn't know it at the time, all the pictures he showed were all done on an iPhone. Yeah. Now, the reason he did it was, again, it wasn't a gimmick. No. He wasn't going around saying, I shoot on an iPhone, therefore you should write articles about me. What he was saying is that when he was in wherever it was, Syria or somewhere, he realised that if you had a camera with a big lens, you were being shot at. Yeah, because they don't like the press out there. And he looked around and realised there were people on the street shooting pictures of each other with an iPhone. So he had the sense to say, well, if I have an iPhone, perhaps I won't get shot at. So that's a good practical reason for doing it.
Yes.
And then discovered that the iPhone now is probably of the quality of the best professional camera of about 5 years ago.
Yes.
I mean, the quality is amazing.
It is, yes, astonishing.
And so in circumstances where it might be quite dangerous or difficult to shoot pictures, you can get away with using an iPhone. It's the thing that's going to totally get rid of all this nonsense about privacy and my personal space and all that sort of bullshit, because everybody shoots pictures on an iPhone now. So it's very difficult for anybody to sort of start talking about their privacy, etc.
Yeah, that's a weird area, isn't it?
Very boring.
And very boring,
yes.
Yeah, boring. Because I was doing something and I was shooting a building and a security guard came out and he said, you're not allowed to photograph here, this is private property.
Yeah.
And I asked him where public property was and he said, over there. And I took one step and was taking exactly the same shots.
I mean, the whole thing is nonsense because the second that you discuss any of these things with anybody, they collapse. They have their statement.
Yes.
I have the right to privacy. So I mean, if somebody says that to me, particularly in a university setting, I say, okay, fine. So what you're saying is you have a right to privacy, or do you mean all people have a right to privacy? And then if they say all people, so I'm saying, well, what you were actually saying is you want to go into your local museum and you want to destroy all the pictures from the past because presumably you think that all those people had the right for privacy and therefore we better get rid of those pictures because we don't have the thing. So I say that's nonsense. Yeah. And the answer is that what we're actually talking about is taste.
Yes.
So I, as a photographer, think, by and large, I haven't a clue who I'm photographing. No. Except a personality. Yeah. When I'm out on the street, I'm not the least bit interested. No. What they become is a symbol of lovers or a symbol of...
Absolutely.
The guy buying his wife a hat.
Yes.
It's a symbol of a certain kind of thing. Yeah. And either you think that's important... Yeah. I think it's important. I think it's very important in violent situations because my experience is that if somebody doesn't want you to be there, it's because they have something to hide. Yeah. Therefore, it seems to me a very good reason to be there.
Yeah, indeed.
Because even if they don't, perhaps they don't go to the excesses that they might go to if you weren't there, So that would be my justification all the time. And of course, obviously, the odd person is going to be distressed or something about it. But when you put that up against, seeing Vietnam Inc., for example, by Philip Jones Griffiths, you suddenly realise that the individual person in some of those pictures not being asked to take pictures is actually, if you're really truthful, is insignificant against the power of the book. Yeah. That book might have helped people think war is a bad thing.
Yes.
Yes. And if you believe that, then I think that's the end of the argument.
So, but I mean, things changed after Vietnam, and access became difficult, or you were embedded and you were controlled by PR or the military in order to, and you weren't allowed really to do your work as you saw fit. Yeah. So, does that sort of clamp down on conflict zones?
I think it just makes it different. Right, you learn to struggle. I mean, the reality is that you weren't embedded. I mean, I wasn't there, but my knowledge of the people that were, you weren't embedded at the time at Vietnam, but in a way you were. Because if you wanted to get to the front line, you needed to be on the helicopter.
Yeah.
And you weren't going to get on that helicopter if you weren't on reasonable terms with whoever was in charge of the helicopters. So it was a subtle impediment. You know, the people like McCullen, etc., knew how to do what they want to do, but boy, oh boy, would they make sure that they knew the right people and all that sort of thing. So when it became embedded in a strange sort of way that seemed tighter, my guess is it was tighter in a way, but then you just adapt to that, and you do, you know, what you do within that thing. So, you know, I when I went to Hungary, before that time, I still have it, but it was a little Kodak folding camera. So when I decided I wanted to go to Hungary, because it just seemed to me an interesting place to go to politically. And I bought a second-hand Contax camera, but I actually went to Hungary with a book, reading the book on how to use it. And you know, I spent most of the time getting to Austria. We got a lift in an ambulance from Austria into Budapest. But, I mean, that's how naive I was. But in another way, I wasn't naive, because I'd always felt photography was easy. You looked at something that you were interested in and you pressed the button. You know, now if you happen to have some sort of inherent instinct for geometry or design or composition, whatever you like to call it, you know, it's basically geometry. It's basically a geometry that's there, not manufactured. You've got to do this thing of which I'm saying, stand in the right place, and the geometry becomes good. And what do you mean by that? You mean it's a way of organising so that the subject matter is projected clearly. That's what good composition is to do with, projecting the subject matter. But you have to know what the subject matter is.
Yes.
You know, most people sort of vaguely think, oh, that's all right. But they don't clearly understand, you know, what they're trying to do. But so when I went into Hungary, I very quickly realised that you can be standing in this street or having coffee in this street, and they're hitting hell out of each other in the next street. And if you're not in the next street, you're not able to shoot the pictures. You're drinking coffee. And that's to do with experience, you learn. So I somehow had the instinct to say, let's find where all the photographers are and the journalists, and let's tag along. You know, which is what I did. We found the hotel, and experience tells me later that by and large, when photographers are en masse, they tend to congregate and stay in the same hotel, etc. One of the reasons for that is that they can cross-fertilise information. Yeah. It's much easier nowadays because you have iPhones and everybody's telling you information. You're picking it up off the BBC and God knows what. But then you didn't have those things, you know. And I with John went and we found the hotel, and it happened that Life magazine were there, and they saw me as a new face, and I think they had one photographer in, but that's all they had in. And so they said, who are you? And I said, oh, I'm a freelance photographer. And they said, OK, you come with us. And so I simply tagged along behind them. And you know, these are some of the world's great journalists. They knew exactly where to go, what to do. And then, you know, I tagged along. And as soon as I saw what they were looking at, which was interesting, and shot a picture of it. You know, it's not rocket science.
No, it's an observation.
Observation, and maybe that little ability to analyse that this is slightly more important than that.
Yes,
you know.
Yes,
and then maybe an instinctive sense of geometry, which produces a picture of which you can see what the subject matter is very clearly, what the picture is in theory about.
Yeah, and the storytelling aspect of it all.
But that's a very instinctive thing.
Yes, it is. Yes.
You know, and and very often I see work which is perfectly competent work, but it's not really about anything clearly. And those are the people that are, you know, just not quite such good photographers. It's as simple as that, you know.
The last question I want to ask you is the power of black and white photography.
Yeah.
What is it about black and white? Or what's just the je ne sais quoi?
Well, it's the beauty of black and white is it's very easy not to get distracted. The problem with colour, for me, I mean, I'm now laying down my colour theory. If you have a yellow tie on now, and the two of you were looking as though you were going to get in a fight or something, I would be interested in the emotional thing between the two of you having a fight. If I shoot it in colour, it first of all becomes a fashion picture of a yellow tie.
Yeah, gets in the way.
That's what you draw. Now, therefore, I think that the people that shoot colour best are very aware of colour.
Yes.
I'm not that interested in colour. I'm much more interested in the emotion. Therefore, shooting in black and white cuts out that distraction of the colour. And so that's my theory of doing it. In practice, I suspect it's because when I started, there wasn't much colour around, and I shot in black and white, and you get used to it, and that's the way you think and the way you see, and therefore you defend what you've been doing. Take your pick. You know, I couldn't care what people do. I do, you know, I mean, obviously, if you shoot digitally, in theory, you shoot in colour.
Yeah.
Because what comes up on the screen is... But the first thing that I do is I flip it all to black and white straight away.
Yeah.
And in Lightroom, it's amazingly easy to do, and it does it really well.
Yes.
Really, really well. Yeah. Although I on the TINTERN thing, I've explored a weeny bit, kind of still lifey things in colour to see what they're like. I don't do it terribly well, so I'm dropping it. But the landscape I've done is all in colour. Right. It's all colour. Yeah. But there's something about landscape that the landscape almost instinctively deals with colour rather well. Nature
yes.
is very good at putting the reds and yellows in the right place.
Absolutely so.
Or if it's in the wrong place, it's usually for some purpose which makes it interesting. You know. So the landscape thing, if it's done, will in fact all be in colour.
What did you think of McCullen's visit to landscape?
Well, it doesn't surprise me. I mean, the thing about McCullen is not that he's a great war photographer, is that he's a great photographer of tension. He loves anything that makes his adrenaline go. Yeah. So it didn't surprise me that when he, you know, when he'd hurt his back or hurt whatever he did and had to more or less give up, because I remember him saying, you can't go and do the kind of photography I do if you can't leap over a wall, you know, which he suddenly couldn't do. And then he decided, he lives in a very nice part of Somerset, I think, and he goes and shoots. But you know, his idea of a good day out in the landscape is it's pissing with rain or freezing cold, and the day that nobody else is going, and that's because
the tension.
That's him.
And yes,
it's him. So one shouldn't be surprised that his landscape pictures are exactly the same as meth drinkers in Liverpool or people shooting in Vietnam. It's totally consistent.
Yeah.
And so it's great. You know, he's the turner that would, if he was going to do it at sea, he would be tied to the mast, you know, as the waves go over his head. You know, he wouldn't be on the Saga cruise. Would not interest him that much. You know, but it's totally predictable. Yeah. Totally predictable. Yeah. Simply that he does what he does. You know, and that's what gives him a buzz, and it's exciting. And that's why some of us feel terribly cold. He gets excited. You know.
Cool.
And he's wonderful. And he's another one of the great photographers. You know, and he's a nice man and a decent man, and cares about. It's a little bit too racked with reminiscences, I think, now. I sometimes think he's sometimes a little bit unhappy about life in general.
Do you have any demons looking back?
No, I don't think so. I've had a wonderful life. You know, I had a lovely childhood. It was, you know, if I look back, we didn't have much money as a family, but I have no memories of ever needing anything. You know, I had a great. I loved school. I went to a boarding school for the second part because of the problems of Dad being away in the army, etc. But I loved that because I was so good at sports, you know. So it simply meant that as soon as we finished school, I could go off, you know, and practice and train and do all that. So I loved boarding school, etc. I liked Sandhurst enormously because it was me going to a university in a way that I wouldn't normally have done. So I loved all that. And then I had this incredibly lucky thing of opening up this flipping magazine. I sometimes think, isn't that bizarre? Yeah. If I hadn't gone into that room and picked up that magazine, well, I wouldn't still be, but I would have been in the army for whatever. But that would have been okay because I was enjoying being in the army. I liked it, you know, it was fair enough. So I tend to, you know, always find the best in things, and I have a lot of self-confidence, you know. So when people say, you know, what would have happened if you were starting now, and I said it would have been exactly the same. You know, I would be in the equivalent of Magnum because that's what I would be striving to do, and I would have the understanding of what it took to do it. And I would be willing to do that kind of sacrifice. You know, I would be the person, you know, photographing the Students' Union,
yes,
and not feeling that I had to go and get pissed to get.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't be interested in being pissed because I wouldn't be able to shoot pictures if I was. You know, and that's how I would be, and I don't think it would be any different now than then. So I love it. And.
How long may it continue, David?
Well, I think it will. I think it will go. You know, I'm one of these people that in the last 10 minutes will be asking for another 5 minutes. You know, because you never know. In that 5 minutes,
that might make the difference.
You might just take that great picture.
Yes.
That you've missed out on all your life.